I was taking summer classes at the time, and we had a 3-day weekend in June, so I thought it would be a good idea to explore the wilderness in Virginia. I searched on Google and found a state park with a nice trail and decided to go there. I made sure to tell my roommate and family which trail I was going to hike, just in case something happened. When I got close to the park, I saw a small outdoor shop where hikers on the Appalachian Trail often stop, so I decided to go in to get a map of the area. While talking to the owner, he mentioned a lesser-known trail that has a cool waterfall and a swimming hole. He told me it was a beautiful spot that not many people know about. I thought it sounded like a great place to visit, so I decided to take that trail instead and asked him to show me the trail on the map. It was outside the state park, but he said it was worth going there. I paid for the map, thanked the owner, and texted my roommate and parents about the new trail. Then I parked my car and started my adventure. I should mention that the waterfall was just a side trip from my main hike. I was planning to spend 3 days and 2 nights on my trip, so I started on a section of the Appalachian Trail which was busy with people. Some of them were really fun to talk to. As I got further from the main trails, I saw fewer and fewer people. In the early afternoon, about 3 miles from my destination, I noticed it was unnaturally silent. No birds, no bugs, not even wind. I also had a strange feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to ignore the feeling, thinking I was just overthinking things. When I got to the waterfall, it wasn't as impressive as I'd hoped, but it was still nice to see. There was a good-sized area to swim, so I took off my clothes and went for a swim. While I was getting dressed again, I started whistling to myself. I was whistling Chill Bill because it was stuck in my head, and that's when I heard something whistle the same tune back at me. I thought it was a bird copying me, so I started whistling back and forth with it. It would repeat whatever I whistled, and I thought it was pretty cool. But as I was setting up my camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again, and I kept getting goosebumps, and my hairs would stand up. As night fell, I built a small fire and used my jet boil to cook dinner. While I was doing this, I noticed that there was no sound at all. Just complete silence. Part of me felt like I wasn't safe and wanted me to leave, but I ignored it. I crawled into my tent with my flashlight and a book and went to sleep without any problems. When I woke up the next morning, my campsite was a mess. My camp stool was missing, and my bear bag with my food had been cut down. At first, I thought a clever animal had chewed through the rope to get to the food, but when I looked at the rope, I saw it was cut with something very sharp. Keep in mind, I was at least 6 to 8 miles from the nearest road. While I was looking at the mess, I heard a branch snap in the distance. I turned to look, but I didn't see anything. Then I heard the whistling again. It was my whistle from yesterday, but it sounded more sinister. It made my hair stand on end, and I knew I needed to trust my instincts and leave quickly. Now the whistling sounded like it was getting closer, so I packed up my camp as fast as I could. I didn't bother putting everything away neatly. I just shoved things into my bag as quickly as possible. The whistling was non-stop and seemed to come from all directions. I got fed up with it, so I stood up and yelled into the woods. The whistling stopped and it was quiet for a moment. Then it repeated what I had said, but in my own voice. It sounded like me, but distorted, like it was coming from an old TV. After I heard that, I quickly threw on my pack and ran back the way I came. I could hear it moving right behind me, switching between whistling and copying my voice. It felt like it was playing with me, staying close but not too close. Eventually the sound started to get further away from me. Then it stopped. Suddenly when it did, I stopped and turned around. I wish I hadn't, because I heard the most terrifying screech right next to me. It was so loud and creepy, it felt like it was coming from inside my head. That's when I started running again, not daring to look back. I just focused on moving as fast as I could. After less than half a mile, I came across a couple who were also backpacking. They looked concerned when they saw me, and I quickly told them what had happened. They saw the look of terror on my face and asked if I had been the one screaming and if I was okay. I told them what had happened, and they decided not to go down the trail I had just come from. We quickly moved to a more populated trail. As soon as I got back to my car, I drove to one of the park's ranger stations and reported what happened. Since the site was outside the park, they said it wasn't their responsibility, but they would send a ranger to check it out. The parking lot at the ranger station was right next to the woods, and as I was getting into my Jeep, I heard the Chill Bill tune coming from the woods right in front of me. I drove out of there as fast as I can. I'm not going to that forest ever again. It was the first time Seattle had ever been in the Super Bowl, in 2005. The only reason I remember that is because I remember the loud cheers that surrounded my friend and me as we were out in the woods, unsure if we would ever be able to escape the dark forest alive. At the time, the cheers sounded more like screams. Let me explain. I was a 14-year-old girl who loved skateboarding with my best friend. We were petite punk girls who loved to explore and skateboard. My friend was over at my house, but everyone there was transfixed by the football game. The whole neighborhood was filled with the sounds of people cheering on the Seahawks. It was, and still is, a safe and normally quiet middle to upper middle class neighborhood. It was around maybe 7 or 8 p.m., but by this point, it was very dark. Not pitch black, but that deepest, starkest blue that remains until midnight. My friend had cigarettes, and we decided we were going to sneak away and skateboard to the forest down the street to smoke and hang out in the woods. The woods were a long stretch of forest that rested in the middle of our neighborhood. On each side, steep slopes ran upward and backed into the fences of people's houses. Everyone called it a green belt because the only entrance was at the beginning and the only exit on the other end. It felt like you were in a valley of sorts, surrounded by trees and houses far above. All the neighborhood kids explored it, and it was not uncommon to find hidden trails that led toward makeshift forts. Anyways, we arrived at the forest and walked until we found a clearing far enough away from the entrance that adults couldn't see us smoking. At the time, we didn't realize this, but most every single adult was inside watching the Super Bowl. It felt safe there in the dark, smoking and laughing with my friend because we could hear cheers echoing from nearby houses. We had enough cigarettes to each have our own, but we liked sharing one at a time and passing it back and forth. It made us feel connected and cool. We were sharing our second one, which was in between my fingers. I remember my friend laughing, trying to grab it from me. All of a sudden, she stopped laughing. Her eyes grew wide and she slowly pointed behind me. Not going to work, Jess, I thought. She was trying to make me look away so she could grab the cigarette out of my hands. I could barely hear her whisper over the cheers that echoed through the forest. I am not joking. I turned around and looked behind me, my eyes squinting in the dark. I didn't see anything until I looked at the top of the slope. The top of the slope, which ran about 50 feet up, was not that far from us. There, a man was standing, watching us. The woods were almost always empty, except for the occasional kid or teenager. Adults just used the woods as a place to dump yard clippings and old compost. He was wearing all black and had on a ski cap. His hands were shoved deeply into his pockets. I remember thinking he was very tall, though I couldn't see his facial features very well. I waved at him, wondering how long he had been standing there. It shocked me that he may have been there the whole time. I hoped it was a neighbor. I waited for him to yell at us for smoking, threatened to tell my parents, anything. He didn't wave back. He didn't make a sound. "Hello?" I choked out. The man did not respond. His hands remained in his pockets. The dim light from a distant back porch behind him illuminated him ever so slightly. I whispered to my friend, "Jess, what do we do?" The man took his hands out of his pockets. He had gloves on, not gardening gloves, but dark gloves. He walked one step down the slope toward us. I could hear the sound of the leaves crunching beneath him. He stood still again, watching, waiting. More cheers erupted in the distance. The cheers that sounded so comforting less than half an hour ago now sounded foreboding. "I don't know," I whispered. "If we scream, no one would even be able to hear us. Everyone is screaming right now." Tears began to pool in her eyes. I had never seen her cry, and I had known her for 9 years by this point. I decided I had to think fast. Then we heard more crunching. The man took another step. I screamed, "What do you want from us?" He began to pull his ski cap down. It was then that we both realized it wasn't a ski cap but rather a ski mask. I yelled at her to run and to grab her skateboard. At the time, I was thinking we'd hit him with our skateboards if he tried anything. Probably silly, seeing as we each only weighed about 100 pounds or less. We got up and began running out of the woods like in a horror movie. The man simply walked at a fast pace after us. I guess we weren't running very fast because we each were holding a skateboard. Once we got out of the woods, it was all uphill back toward my house. The man was a house-length distance or so behind us. His mask pulled back up again. I wanted to ring a neighbor's doorbell, yell, anything, but we were so scared. Scared no one could hear us. Scared that if we ran to a neighbor's house, they wouldn't be home. We ran as fast as we could up that hill. We were about 3 houses away from my home when the man behind us just stopped. We kept running until we made it back to my house, breathing heavily and covered in dirt from running through the forest. What exactly had just happened? Girls, there you are. I thought my dad was angry that we had left without asking. Instead, he just sighed and said, "Well, the Seahawks just lost the Super Bowl." In 2014, a man named Ethan and his wife, Danny, were spending a weekend together on Vancouver Island, which they had done many times before. The couple had a lot of experience on the island and with camping in general. Vancouver Island provides an optimal camping setting because of its mix of scenic beaches and dense forests. The couple had many successful camping trips on the island until something truly terrifying happened to them on their final outing there. Ethan and Danny were far from any roads or civilization, enjoying the solitude. They set up camp on a beach a good distance from anywhere and kept a fire going. To reach the trail that led from the beach, they had to walk 1 kilometer along the beach and then another 2 kilometers through the forest to the road. Earlier that day, the couple had met another camper named Leon from New Zealand, whom they ran into on the beach. Leon was planning on sleeping in his van, which he parked back up on the road. The couple invited him down to the beach for a fire, and the 3 shared a bottle of wine, talking amongst themselves around the fire. This is where things started to get a little creepy. The sun was beginning to set, and the trio kept hearing what sounded like female voices coming from the bushes behind them, dividing the beach from the forest. It wasn't too dark out yet, so it was still possible that they were just other hikers or campers nearby, or maybe even a group who anchored offshore, with the sound bouncing in a weird way. All 3 agreed that they were definitely hearing female voices, though. It was getting late and a little dark, so Leon said goodbye and set out to hike back to his car before it got too dark. Ethan and Danny stayed by their campsite, stoking the fire, as Danny was starting to get creeped out by the voices, which continued into the darkness. It sounded like 2 female voices speaking, but whatever was being said was unintelligible. To the couple, it seemed as if the voices were not far beyond the tree line. They stayed up very late tending to the fire, and only when the voices finally stopped did they decide to put out the fire and go to sleep in the tent. Before doing so, the 2 scanned the cove with a flashlight several times, looking for boats that could have been the source of the talking, but there was nothing in sight. Around 3 a.m., they finally lay down, ready to catch some sleep. But about 15 minutes after they lay down, Ethan and Danny heard footsteps in the area around their campsite, over by where the fire had been. The sounds came from the direction of the bushes toward the inland behind them, a direction that was not typically traversable by people. The couple lay there, hoping it was just a bear or some other animal, as the only bears on the island were black bears, which are usually timid around people. The footsteps moved from the fire over to the tent, then back into the woods. 5 minutes later, the footsteps returned to the fire. And now, clear as day, there were 2 female voices talking gibberish very loudly. Their communication didn't resemble any language known to Ethan or Danny, and the voices seemed to be talking over each other, having what could barely be considered a conversation, at full volume, in the dead of night, far away from civilization. They navigated without lights, moving relatively quietly through dense brush, in a direction that seemed impossible to traverse on foot. The 2 voices moved from the fire pit area over to the tent, still speaking at a loud volume. They stood over the tent, talking for a few seconds, then went completely silent. The voices faded as they went back into the woods, never to be seen or heard again. Ethan and Danny lay there, completely frozen and terrified, for a long time. They woke up around 11 a.m. the next day, exhausted from how late they had fallen asleep. They packed up first thing and never returned. The couple likely made the best decision by remaining quiet in the tent, not drawing attention to themselves from whoever or whatever was outside the tent.